This is part 2 of a series I'm doing about the history of farm labor in the United States. If you like this topic, if you're interested, as I am, in the history of immigration, legal and otherwise, in the United States, please follow. I will be posting a lot about this topic. I think it's a really important one to be talking about in our current political time. So let's get into it. When we left off, I was talking about the fairly liberal labor laws in the late 1800s in the United States that meant that the farmers could import workers from other countries who could do this farm labor. I talked about the economic pressures that keep farm wages low, or keep the owners of farms motivated to keep those wages low, because the margins of farming are just really tight and it is a very precarious, capricious business. It depends on the weather, it depends on the markets, it depends on whether or not the locusts come. Like, there's just a lot going on with a farm. It's a difficult business. So there's a lot of pressures that keep the farmers wanting to not pay people enough. Now, that does not make them right. It's not okay to exploit farm workers. I want to be very clear about that. But I just want to let you know that the issues that we're seeing with farm workers not being paid enough is a very, very old, if not ancient, problem. So farm workers in the late 1800s, early 1900s were heavily exploited. They were immigrants. They were people on the margins of society who didn't have other options, didn't have other work that they could take. Now, that's not to say that there weren't farm workers who were highly skilled, because there are farm workers who are highly skilled now and were then. But there's going to be a lot of labor on a farm that is pretty easy for anyone to do, and people will pick up that seasonal labor. Prior to World War II, there were a lot of folks working on farms who ended up either volunteering or getting drafted into World War II. And the United States at the beginning of that war was very worried about there being food shortages and there not being enough labor in the fields to pick the crops to feed the soldiers in this war. And so they began what became known as the bracero program. Bracero refers to anyone who works with their hands. Brazo in Spanish is arm, and it refers to sort of like, like the physical labor. And so the bracero program began, and the United States gave special visas to a large group of Mexican farm workers to come to the United States and do farm labor on American farms. And they wanted to incentivize these people to come. They needed them to come. And so what they offered were minimum wage, high wages, so $1.40 an hour at the end of the program. This program ran for about 20 years. It started out, I think, 80 cents an hour, ended the program in 1965 at about $1.40 an hour, which I looked it up, and it translates to about $14.50 an hour now. So close to $15 an hour, which is about what farm workers are currently being paid in California, as far as what I could find online. If you work on farms, you can let me know if that's true or not. So, a decent wage, a minimum wage, but a decent wage. So they were promised that. They were promised good working conditions. They were promised to be fed 3 meals a day. And they were also guaranteed that some of their wages would be saved in bank accounts in Mexico. Now, just because they were promised these things doesn't mean that when they arrived to do the work that those things were in place. The braceros were subject to wage theft. There were farmers who refused to pay them that amount of money that was promised to them. There were farmers who stole the remittances that were supposed to go to Mexico. Those remittances never arrived. Sometimes those remittances were stolen in Mexico, and sometimes the farm workers were never given the information they needed to access those bank accounts. They never were able to access the bank accounts, so that money was just gone. So some portion of their money that was being saved for remittances just disappeared. So there was that. Also, they faced housing that was decrepit, that was unsanitary, that was falling down, cold, dirty, infested, all the things you might imagine. So they were not, even though they were guaranteed decent housing, it did not always exist when they showed up. And in general, they were not always given what they were promised. But because they were here as a part of a legal American government program, and they were promised these things were in the contract, this was part of the law that brought them here, this was part of the program, they were able to strike when they weren't given what they were promised. And these strikes were often successful. I'm not going to say they were successful 100% of the time, but because these workers had legal protections, they were able to strike and strike successfully. Now, in 1965, there was a feeling that a lot of these braceros had been in the United States for 20 years, and a lot of them had well-established relationships with the farms that they were working on. A lot of them wanted to apply to have resident status. They wanted to get their green cards. They wanted to bring their families over. They wanted to become citizens of the United States. And this was not the plan. The plan was to bring them over and have them go home. And turns out if somebody works on the land in a particular place for 20 years, they form some attachments to it. They might like it, and they might want to bring their families there. So in 1965, they ended the program, I think, largely due to the fact that they did not want these people to stay. And yet they still needed the labor. And so one thing they tried to do is they started a high school farm workers program where they were supposed to hire like 18,000 high school students to come work on farms during the summer in 1965. And they managed to hire, I think, like 5,000, and even then they quit because being a farm worker is really, really hard. It's really hard, and the ways that they were being asked to work were not okay. And these young men had other options, and so they chose them. So, I guarantee you the Trump administration is going to say something like, well, Americans will just fill these jobs. Americans have demonstrated over and over again that they do not want these jobs because these jobs are really tough. So in 1965, the workers that remained who had been born here or were immigrants from other programs besides the Bracero program, they started to advocate for wage increases. When the braceros left, a lot of the farmers tried to pull some nonsense and pay the workers who remained less than that guaranteed wage from the bracero program. And there was a group of Filipino farm workers in Delano, California, who were supposed to be picking table grapes, and the grower tried to offer them a wage that was less than what the braceros were earning, and they weren't having it, so they went on strike. And down the road, there was a group of Mexican farm workers who were also supposed to be picking table grapes in Delano, and they met in the community hall for a couple of days, and they talked about it, and they talked about, like, can we afford to strike? Will we be able to strike? Will we be able to make this happen if we join the Filipino farm workers? But they decided to do it, and they eventually formed the UFW, the United Farm Workers Union, from the Union of the Filipino workers and the Mexican workers. And they had a successful strike in Delano, and they were able to guarantee that same wage of $1.40 an hour, which is about $15 today. But it didn't last, and I'm going to come at you with part 3 of farm workers in the United States.